would also think about it as like tools for making things, and then artifacts that are made and finished, scores that are kind of the basis for performance, and then, you know, recordings that are the kind of freezing of that performance into kind of one moment. So a whole set of phenomena kind of in the world, in cities, in the urban environment, or in a way, one of these kind of perhaps oversimplified ways of like categorizing things into this kind of spectrum, but then to perhaps problematize that a little bit and to look at how it plays out in some different projects, and how a kind of questioning of that plays out in some different projects, and how we can also use artistic practices or particular forms of artistic and creative production, not just as kind of phenomena within the city, but also as perhaps metaphors or ways of kind of getting at some of these ideas, and then how that kind of might connect to a politics of like cities that are constituted by symbolic form, that are perhaps frozen, that are perhaps kind of seen as finished or imaged, or kind of that are produced to create an image, and then cities that are kind of exist or are more characterized by their usefulness or their usability for their inhabitants to produce their own conditions of living, their own cultural environments, their own kind of forms of expression and contestation of existing, you know, finished forms of culture. So that's the kind of field I'm trying to get at. I'm going to try this there we go. Yeah, I'm going to kind of, I can't now see you all, but you can probably see me against a screen full of all sorts of things, a kind of constellation of references and projects and work that I've done that kind of get at this idea that I'm going to kind of, you know, place around on the table. This is our table, rather than kind of like tell as a kind of lecture or a narrative, although hopefully it'll all make sense together. So to come to say a little word about Theatrum Mundi and what it is, maybe let's be on Theatrum Mundi's website while we do that. We are a research center founded by Richard Sennett, who many of you will know or know his work. He founded Theatrum Mundi as a series of conversations between artists and urbanists to understand the kind of overlaps between their ways of working, their ways of making and thinking, not so much, again, between the kind of outcomes of their work, between the relationship between making sonic form, making music, making movement, making choreographic form, and then the you know, stage, and then doing in the street, which is of course what architects do much of the time without realizing, always kind of staging movement, staging sound, staging voice, staging stories, you know, often without realizing. So kind of how can those worlds learn from each other? And his book, The Craftsman, looks very much at kind of placing value within processes of making, looking at the value of them before they reach a kind of an outcome, and how by making kind of alongside how different people and practices making alongside one another can kind of form solidarities. So that also provides a kind of background, The Craftsman as a book, to this kind of valuing of process and of production as a kind of an end in itself, as a mode of engagement with the world, as well as a necessity for kind of reaching form. And when I talk about form, obviously I'm talking about architecture, also landscape, urbanism, as well as, you know, artistic form. And Theatrum Mundi works by kind of, I mean, we work in a very iterative way, which also I think gets to this. I studied music as my undergraduate, and I got interested in cities via kind of urban soundscape and urban acoustic ecology. And I remember thinking at the time, as I started to get interested in architecture, being so struck by the fact that kind of new buildings and architecture were always represented through static images, in terms of, you know, like the kind of archy porn kind of online magazines that circulate images of kind of new projects, and they're always static. Of course, we've started to go past the situation where they're always without people and they're just this kind of like, it's about the image of the building. They've started to maybe be more peopled, and like renders are much more peopled these days, but there's almost, you know, in ways that have kind of been slightly problematic, and kind of who are those people in the renders. But even then, they're still without sound. They're still without, you know, if you freeze a moment in time, it's impossible to have sound, because sound requires kind of an unfolding of time in order to exist. So yeah, this kind of idea of like architecture as image making, and photos without sound, and whether that kind of feeds into this problematic within architecture, where instead of kind of circulating, well, not so much architecture, but within city making more generally, that often there's a kind of circulation of images of particular places or situations that are seen as kind of successful or best practice. And rather than looking at the conditions that led to those situations, there's a kind of replicating of the aesthetics. And obviously that kind of happens, you know, through architectural design and the kind of generation, you know, trends within architecture, I suppose, that become globalized. And I suppose we can perhaps think back to like international modernism, and as the kind of like first point at which, I mean, that wasn't through the circulation of images, that was through the kind of colonial export of form. But like, I'm even thinking of places like this. This is Campo de Cebada in Madrid. It was a kind of disused plot within the center of Madrid that was taken over by local residents as a kind of, not just a kind of social space, but a real debating space for the city, for the neighborhood, to actually like take decisions and actually kind of really use the kind of political assembly and kind of taking specific political decisions that were kind of actioned. But, you know, and they used, of course, available materials and kind of old wire rolls and kind of palettes and all of this kind of thing that we recognize so well now, and has become a kind of aesthetics that's now replicated for social spaces, and is often replicated by perhaps developers in kind of meanwhile use projects, or even now in permanent, you know, forms of design or space making for social spaces. And I think, so this was a real example of me of where the kind of end result of a process of space making by a community and where the materials were kind of contingent or necessary, then becomes a kind of image to replicate, and it's seen as a kind of social, a successful social space. And then we start to kind of see the end result and the image of that become replicated, rather than the actual kind of process of access to space, agency over that space, and kind of like, you know, grassroots level cooperation that led to the production of these specific materials and objects that form the social space. So then I was thinking about this process as kind of similar to the way that like scores and recordings work, in a sense. You know, when you kind of listen to the recording of music, you're hearing the end result of a process of some kind. And of course, you know, things like computer, you know, music and like electronic production really kind of challenge that and bring that process down sometimes to the individual relationship between a person and their laptop. But of course, there's all sorts still of layers of infrastructure behind the moment or the situation of production, even if it's an individual act. But if we think of other kinds of music, of course, the score is this kind of invisible knowledge infrastructure which encodes a set of actions. Do we have a score? Here we go. We can go to this little window. Actually, no, I'm going to go to this one. Yeah, a score as a kind of knowledge infrastructure that encodes a set of actions in a way that can be kind of to a lesser or greater degree prescriptive. And I guess I started to think about whether scores could kind of offer a way of thinking about how knowledge of how to do space, rather than kind of what it looks like and what it is, could be circulated. And as I mentioned, I studied music as an undergraduate at Goldsmiths, and I played the saxophone. I still in theory do, but like very minimally. I used to play kind of the music of people at, you know, my colleagues at my cohort at university, but I really loved playing Bach as well, because it you have these kind of incredible scores that are just like this series of notes that I mean, this is an original one, but I could have, you know, the scores that I was reading are kind of, they look very dense in a way, but they have very little instruction to how, you know, in terms of expression, in terms of where you breathe, where you pause. They're just a kind of like straight series of notes. And somehow still they manage to give you so many different possibilities of kind of, of how you draw form out of this kind of like idea that's encoded on the page. Yeah, I mean, like something like this is so, its moment of creation is kind of like so specific, so grounded. But then of course, over time, something like Bach becomes, the more it becomes distance from the kind of, from the place and the time of its creation, the more in a weird way, it's the things it can lead to expand. So now you see, you know, me, my undergraduate, playing Bach on the saxophone in spaces that I found that had incredible acoustics, because Bach, you know, when you play the notes one after another and you can hear the harmonies as they layer, as they kind of linger and sound together, whereas when you play them in a dead room, it just kind of sounds like a bunch of separate things one after another. But then there were much more there's all sorts of much more interesting experiments with Bach, played on Balinese gamelan, or played on, you know, early synthesizers, or kind of chopped up and like turned into fragments and reordered. This is an amazing performance by an opera company in Paris that we're working with on the project in the north of Paris, Chapelle Charbon, which is a whole other story that I won't go into, that kind of chops up Bach into fragments and kind of uses it as the basis for them for this whole kind of social situation that emerges. But the point of that is that kind of, it's this music that's incredibly detailed. It's complete. It doesn't leave anything kind of like, you know, like none of the notes are guessed. They're all completely there. But somehow over time, it's become this thing that's circulated globally, that's kind of a knowledge infrastructure that becomes incarnated in so many different places and situations as people pick it up and find that they can do different things with it. So I suppose the point of that is that, you know, when I talk about scores, I don't necessarily, I'm not necessarily talking about the idea that it's completely open, you can do whatever you want. You can also have this kind of incredible level of information and detail that makes possible something that wasn't possible otherwise. You know, I wasn't very confident with improvising at the time. And I found that kind of having this framework, this scaffold with which to make sound that I found so rich, then you had so much possibility to work with that, but yet the outcome was not determined. So yeah, there we have kind of architecture as image making, and kind of recordings versus scores, and also kind of the infrastructures that lead to a situation versus the situation itself. So another project we have at Theatrum Mundi is urban backstages, and it's a phrase that we kind of use to talk about the idea of cultural infrastructure, which yeah, is a phrase that's beginning to be used quite a lot in kind of policy making and urban planning. You know, it was originally mostly thought of as a way to talk about investment in kind of huge scale kind of cultural spaces like the Sydney Opera House, or you know, building a new kind of Guggenheim, whatever. And I suppose by talking about the backstage, we wanted to kind of look at how cultural infrastructure could be appropriated as a concept, to make it more about how culture comes to be rather than the spaces in which it's performed and displayed. And the backstage, I suppose, then relates very much to the scores. You know, scores are the things that you kind of use to rehearse, to learn, to kind of pass knowledge from one person to another. But they don't necessarily, you know, they're not part of the performance. They're not shown to the audience. So kind of what are the settings and the conditions within which people produce culture that are not visible to, you know, in a public notion of cultural life within the city, but which are the essential infrastructures that underpin the existence of a cultural life for the city. I'm kind of flicking very slowly through my computer, struggling with like having all of these things open, I think. But essentially, looking at the notion of infrastructure as beyond just the kind of physical space, which is very important. But then, of course, there's what pre-existed, for example, the railway arches, and then how that was kind of slowly adapted over time. And then there's the kind of access times and the planning use class and all of the kind of social fabric that builds up in a, for example, informally adapted space for Latin American businesses, or which are kind of producing food, some of them producing clothing, like hairdressers, which also then themselves become the infrastructures for the sustenance of a Latin American community within a particular part of London in Elephant and Castle. So in this sense, then, infrastructures and cultural infrastructure starts, I think of it as encoding a kind of right to the city. So whereas if this is coming back to the idea that if kind of cities are dominated by kind of performance, dominated by the finished product, dominated by the outcomes of culture, and dominated by the spaces within which culture is performed, then they exclude or they squeeze out the space within which people can produce culture. And, you know, this is beginning to be very well appreciated by, for example, the GLA, the Mayor of London, but it's talked about very much as a kind of economic issue. It's talked about as an issue of access to, you know, that London's status as a kind of hub of the creative industries is going to be challenged if we don't have the spaces, you know, the workspaces. So, you know, one of my, you know, one of the threads of this for me is kind of shifting that narrative about why we need cultural infrastructure to a political one, to one in which the kind of conditions to produce new performances of what public life is or of what cultural life is are accessible to kind of not just those who have means, but those who have less means, to new immigrant communities, to, you know, who can also arrive and start to shift the kind of sonic and material and, you know, olfactory, the sensory environment of a place, and start to transform it to one constituted by, a new set of cultural practices. And that can't happen, for example, where, you know, all of the available space has been colonized by either, I suppose, by, you know, retail or kind of galleries, or indeed, but particularly big institutions, which have extremely high barriers to access in terms of who can decide what they show. Whereas the kinds of spaces that we're kind of looking at as the urban backstage are ones in which are ones that are kind of very easy or accessible to kind of get hold of and start using to create new things. So yeah, we have kind of cultural infrastructure as a right to the city, and perhaps as a kind of set of, as a score, in the sense that it's a kind of set of enabling conditions for things to happen. But then the score is also, again, this idea that like, for me, I suppose it's not necessarily that it represents a solution to this is a way of doing things, but I suppose this metaphor of the score becomes sorry, there's a bit of like noise in the background here, but like, yeah, it becomes a metaphor for the relationship between knowing to and knowing how, which is a phrase that comes from a text that was the first thing I recommended to Eugenio as I was going to send out from Keller Easterling's Extra Statecraft. So it's this kind of like the difference between saying that things should be a certain way, knowing that we should do something, and circulating that knowledge. So circulating the kind of like, you know, we know that this is good, so we should do this, versus circulating how you do that, creating a set of conditions within which this can emerge, you know, like having the space, having the materials, having the access to funding if needed, but then from a kind of top-down perspective, not then, you know, being able to step back and kind of allow, you know, offer those conditions and then step back and allow people to take hold of them and kind of produce. But then again, there's, you know, without wanting to kind of fall into a trap where then the state steps back and actually kind of doesn't provide the essential infrastructure that's needed. So that's where I kind of come back to, and I suppose I'll finally come on to Scoring the City, which was a kind of project where we really wanted to use, I think, scores as a metaphor for getting at some of this stuff, for like what the different relationships and roles within city making as a process is. And I showed you obviously Bach, where you have this incredibly solid scaffolding, and you have so much to work with, and then but you can still kind of add interpretation. And for some reason I saw parallels between that and something like the shopping center in Elephant and Castle, which some of you, those in London and kind of following, you know, following urbanism will very much know as a kind of a real political touch point in the city that's finally been demolished, and there's been a big fight by the Latin American community in Elephant and Castle to protect it, because it had become a kind of hub of Latin American life and had been taken hold of and kind of subtly shifted in ways that made it into a place that kind of supported cultural practices and forms of gathering that were very much characterized by the communities from Colombia, particularly, and the rest of Latin America who were there. But it was nonetheless it was a modernist shopping center that was seen as like extremely fixed, you know, modernism was seen as kind of, there's this kind of narrative, of course, that modernism had failed because it was too rigid and too fixed and we couldn't do anything with it, and it couldn't be adapted in the way that kind of small scale urban form and could kind of adapt slowly over time. And so it's kind of, you know, in the same way that we wouldn't think of Bach as an open score that kind of allows allows you to do whatever you want, I found it incredibly freeing to have this very, very solid infrastructure, but then could allow you to kind of add inflections of different cultural ideas to it. And again, which I was seeing in these other performances of Bach, like on the gamelan, or so then in Scoring the City, I suppose, taking that starting point of like, well, why can something be so solid, but nonetheless be open to interpretation and adaptation and transformation via other cultural ideas? And so working with Garcia Uzunian, because she's a long-term collaborator, Theatrum Mundi, an incredible scholar of contemporary music and experimental music, but also particularly now, and she's just launched a new project called Sun Cities. Actually, that should have been on my, maybe I can just add it on my little table here. She's just launched a new 5-year big funded project to look at kind of encoding some of these ideas into like really usable forms of practice for urban design. So please have a look at that, and a kind of continuation of Scoring the City will be part of that. But her and I came together and started talking about some of these slightly random thoughts that I've been sharing with you. And we kind of hit at the same time on this shared idea of scores as something really interesting to look at, because we had a shared interest in the first place in more like urban soundscape, and in listening and in recording and all of these kind of ways of getting into what's going on in cities via sound. But then, in a way, for me, when you look at scores, of course, in a sense, they resemble blueprints or architectural designs more than they do have a direct connection to urban soundscape and what we hear every day in the city. And so in a way, we kind of wanted to get something with scores that was not about sound, actually, that's more about notation and how knowledge and ideas about what something's going to be, what a space is going to be, are actually encoded and put on paper. And so Gassia brought together this amazing collection of references, some of which are actually architectural ones, but you almost wouldn't know, kind of flicking through quickly, which are architectural ones and which are scores. And all of these scores kind of represent for me different relationships between idea and knowledge, and a conception of what could be, and then how that conception or idea or knowledge is performed as a reality. And some of them are extremely prescriptive, much more prescriptive than you would think. Some of them are almost more like just paintings, visual artworks, which kind of work as the inspiration for something else. And so in each of these scores, I suppose, for me, there's a kind of encoding of a set of relationships between the person who conceives, the person who kind of realizes that form, and then the personal people in all of these situations who kind of experience that. And in a sense, for me, that had a real parallel to the relationship between the architect, who is kind of, to some degree, removed from the physicality and in a very traditional sense of architecture, and conceives of form, then the builder, the constructor, the kind of like the craftsperson who realizes that form as built space, and then those who live in, use, kind of, and receive, but that form. And in some forms of music, the audience, those who receive, are really intended just to receive. They have no feedback into that, and that's the same with some kinds of architecture. And then, of course, similarly, there are kinds of music that have tried to really break down the boundaries between audience and stage, there's parallels in how, I suppose, in an ongoing, how in a parallel way, kind of music started to try to perhaps say that the audience should have some kind of, or the performer should have more say over actually how the piece is, and therefore you kind of provide these interpretive things, and then there's a valorizing of the knowledge, or the kind of embodied knowledge of the performer. And this comes back, maybe circling back to the beginning, even though I feel like I have hardly even begun to point to most of these things. This comes back to, in a way, to Richard Sennett and the craftsman, and his pointing to kind of well, in a way, like these new ideas of kind of valorizing the moment of kind of realization, and the relationship between the performer and the kind of composer, is in a way going back to older relationships between kind of notions of architecture and notions of building, where building was much more of a craft and the architect's plan was much more of a kind of loose framework that was filled out and kind of like completed by the builder as a craftsperson. So yeah, essentially the process of scoring the city was to bring together a series of workshops where we kind of studied these scores together and brought together architects who had never looked at this kind of thing before, and musicians who had perhaps never looked at this kind of thing before. And essentially to try and challenge people to step halfway towards the other practice. So in each of the 4 workshops that we organized, we brought people together, we studied these scores, we had a performer who performed like some of these scores and actually talked about how they went from what's on paper to a performance. And then we walked a site and we set, we set particular questions in each site. And we asked people to kind of conceive of an intervention or a documentation of that site, drawing from the modes of representation that they'd seen within these scores. And we did that in 4 different cities. And yeah, essentially we invited them people to share their scores, which are here. And I mean, there's a couple of those people here, so maybe they can talk also a little bit about what they were thinking and doing that, because I kind of feel embarrassed to present their work while they're here to you. But I suppose, yeah, when we call this an experiment, I suppose, yeah, it was very much in just seeing a first step in seeing kind of how like architects could start to kind of learn from other forms of notation, essentially, and start to think of other ways of representing a conception of a space that kind of, and it's not necessarily again about solving like, well, if we use scores, everyone will be able to kind of, it'll be more participatory. It's more about drawing attention to the potential relationships between these different acts of kind of imagining, notating, encoding knowledge on paper, and how that's passed on to someone else, and then how that person works with that, and then what different kinds of city making processes that can kind of lead to. Gosh, I really thought I was just giving a brief intro, but I've talked for ages.
Maybe we can chat and discuss some of the ideas that if anyone's seen anything on your screen that they like or they're particularly drawn to. I'm sorry, my internet is weird, so I'm on 2 screens at the moment. But thanks for that brief intro. Does anyone have any thoughts they'd like to maybe share?
I have one.
Yes.
So I don't know a lot about music, and I think you kind of already made this comparison, but it seemed to me that a relation between scores and plans, like the interpretations you can make, the freedom in scores, is it I mean, maybe this is more of a question than a comment, but is it the same as, for example, say in a 1 to 200 plan of black walls, so there's possibilities for how these walls will be executed, but then in a technical drawing, you have the fine detail drawn much more precisely. Is it somehow is it the same range in a score as there? Can you have the loose and the precise?
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of, I think in a similar way to perhaps how there was in, how there has been in kind of city making, which of course, like became codified, I suppose, through the 19th and 20th century as a kind of like science in a sense. And was much more of, in many cases, either an emergent process or a kind of one of reproduction of power through the kind of imposing of a, perhaps an urban plan that was around the upkeep of monarchical power or the kind of demonstration of monarchical power. But so you had this perhaps, but mostly more kind of emergent way of it happening, and then it becomes kind of codified as a science. And then the 20th century also kind of represents this like gradual breaking down of that process in music as well as architecture, I suppose, into, and challenging of, Western, and I suppose I'm speaking very much here from a Western classical music point of view, where classical notation became a completely kind of fixed system, where everything which is, in Western classical music, where everything that's played needs to be notated and represented exactly, there's nothing kind of beyond the score up until, I don't know, like the kind of 40s, I suppose, and then beginning to kind of be like different experiments in changing that and in reintroducing different forms of relationship between what's on paper and what you hear, as a political project, as one of kind of like reintroducing notions of freedom into music, where, that had been completely kind of, the composer, I suppose, in the like late 19th century notion of Western classical music is the lone genius who kind of doesn't even need the orchestra. They just, the kind of score is the work. And then the kind of like orchestra is just there trying to realize it. I don't know, kind of, or at least that like, all of the genius is in the kind of like, is in the writing, and it's in the notes, and there's a kind of devaluing perhaps of the performer to a degree. So I think that, and you see, I think there's a parallel with like perhaps early modernist architecture, like where the plan, like the Corbusian plan, becomes this kind of ultimate like representation of what could be, but the reality can never quite kind of match that perhaps, or and so I think there's a parallel process of kind of, breaking that down and reintroducing the valuing of use and change and adaptation, or the revaluing of craft, practices like Assemble that kind of like, reintroduce the idea of design build as not a kind of like failure in architecture, but as a kind of essential ethical engagement with the materials that you're working with, and a feedback loop between materials and the knowledge that then kind of like underpins your design process. And I think of, lots of practices are kind of thinking in that way now, if I understand right, like the kind of the resonance between a tactile engagement with materials and the craft of that, and then kind of how that can work, how that can turn into forms of knowledge that actually enable us to better address like the climate crisis, and that enable us to kind of better address the like ethical relationship of people and the spaces they inhabit. So yeah, I suppose for me, it's not so much that scores are going to solve any of that, but I think it's interesting to see that there's this kind of parallel process in another art form where all of that's kind of going on as well. And actually you realize that it's kind of like, which way round is it? Is the shift in these art forms driving the kind of social change perhaps? Are they driving changing ideas of power relationships between these actors of the, the architect, the kind of community, the build, like slash, the audience, the composer, the performer, perhaps, or which way round is it? Where is the agency?
Can I make a comment as well?
Yeah.
Just on the end of that, it's a bit like how architectural drawing, or like detailed drawing, is in itself a notation which already becomes exclusive, because it's very difficult as an average person to read an architectural drawing that is like a detail. So I think a lot, already by developing this sort of technical notation, which I guess on one hand is important because it allows you to classify how things are built in a sort of efficient way. But then again, you're already excluding a lot of people from the conversation at that point, with a 1 to 10 or a 1 to 5 detail section, mm-hmm. that don't know how to read it. So I guess, is there a way in which we can create an architectural score that gives enough information as you said, David, you know, to the 1 to 200 scale, where you can understand spatially how something works, but then you leave more to the interpretation of the craftsman, as you said, John, to sort of do in the best way that they know their craft to be able to build something. And I think that's the sort of parallel that I think I sort of
definitely
got from this.
Exactly. And I suppose the reason I'm kind of building all of this, you know, scoring the city in itself was a kind of, you know, it's also an experiment in seeing what happens when people from one way of working, one craft, start to kind of actually look into what's behind the scenes in another craft as well. And it's not necessarily that the score that, you know, you as an architect can hand a score, you know, to someone else, but it's about how you learn from the forms of like knowledge sharing that go on, I think, within another art form as well, and how you learn from the kind of ethics and the power relationships within that to start to go, well, actually, we assume that the value is in this part of the chain. I mean, there is a huge devaluing, I think, within, you know, like, well, a strange relationship in contemporary architecture between like contractors and a kind of antagonistic one. But then not just contractors, also like people, you know, clients and those, you know, there's all of these kind of behind the scenes things. I noticed, you know, recently in things like the AJ, the Architects Journal, you know, when they're kind of you know, when there's a project that's like, you know, been approved but shouldn't have been, or like whatever, they're still kind of like, they'll name the architects, they'll say like Adam Khan Architects hotel called, you know, completely inappropriate by the council, but there's like the client behind there as well. So kind of like, you know, which also in music was the case, like at most of, you know, in kind of most of the like Baroque era, like there was always actually all of, you know, most of the Baroque composers were like court musicians who were basically living under patronage of like, you know, kings and queens or nobility or whatever. I don't know the right terminology, and kind of like, I don't know, again, it's kind of just interesting about drawing out how there are similar power structures going on within these things, and how another art form has specifically worked against those. And I think because music also, like all of those relationships are there, but there's a kind of, you know, you can take risks in challenging them and breaking them down perhaps more easily. I
mean, I think a really good example is jazz, isn't it?
Yeah.
And because jazz is a manifestation as well of a social oppression, you know, and how jazz was born as well was a way of sort of a way of expressing catharsis and opposing a sort of racially oppressive system. And then there is like, you have a framework which is so loose. You have a chord sequence and a main tune, and then everything else is a negotiation between the different actors and musicians within the piece. I think that's amazing.
Exactly. And also the fact that jazz, you know, emerged from a condition in which if you want to hear something, you play it yourself, kind of thing, rather than, oh, I just got a echo. Right. Yeah, if you want to hear something, you play it yourself. And so like, you know, those classic tunes that kind of circulate, but then hearing it is also the condition of kind of working with other people to play it. But then in that process, there's always your own kind of like knowledge, emotions, physical condition at that time, which is kind of working through into it. So again, like how does the kind of like bodily knowledge, the kind of emotional, you know, sensitivity and awareness of someone who actually puts one brick on top of another present in the building itself? It's not, because it's kind of squeezed out by not by architects, by the forms of practice and by the kind of structures and processes of, you know, going from conception to space that we have within the kind of wider architectural system. So again, it's kind of, yeah, as you say, there's lessons out there and situations out there of kind of how completely different models have, are possible, of how knowledge of how to do something or how a kind of artifact is passed around and circulated culturally.
Yeah.
I jump in quickly. I just wanted to say that I did this Scrolling City with John, and since then I've been reading a lot around stuff, and I've been reading Philip Teal, and one of his books called People, Parts and Purposes. It kind of mentions what you were talking about, the detailed section, and rather than it not being a construction specification, but these scores being like a performance specification for how people kind of use space. And it's actually come into play in my work recently because we're trying to get into the co-live sector at my work, and we're trying to determine to what extent we provide a scaffold for community to form, but then also to what extent you allow community to naturally form by itself. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting parallel of how that is potentially coming into play into the kind of like real built circumstances. And I just have a question as well, John, or whoever really, because I've struggled with the fact that architecture is so rigid and the fact that it costs a lot of money to do stuff, and then how do you play with that looseness within that scaffold in such a rigid, expensive industry, really?
Yeah, I mean, like, of course, like an annoying academic, like, I suppose I feel more, yeah, I obviously don't really have the answer particularly for architecture the annoying academic who's like, more questions than answers. But like, I think one of the really kind of difficult things to get right, and again, when I said at the beginning, I wanted to kind of problematize the idea that like looseness is always kind of good, because looseness can also favor those who have the kind of means to fill the gaps and who have the kind of pre-existing, informality, for example, like as a, I'm going to name and shame here. Like, I feel like when I was at LSE Cities, because that's where Theatrum Mundi was founded, and I feel like there was this really, there was this kind of fetishizing of informality and kind of learning from these conditions of kind of informal city making and the ingenuity that emerges. And when I showed at the beginning the space in Madrid, the Campo de Cebada, which kind of becomes then like replicated as this kind of aesthetics of really like engaged community space. And if it's pallets, then it must be communal, even if it's been kind of paid for and installed by a developer. The reason people built that space is because there was no like public deliberation, kind of community, like gathering space to actually get together and do political organizing. And they had to build a space because there was nothing there. So this kind of notion of openness and looseness can also equate to a kind of like an unwillingness to kind of provide what's needed for the fundamentals of urban life. So coming back to your question, Jake, it's like, how do you get the right balance between kind of like not having an image in your mind of what community looks like in this particular setting? Like, people will want a kind of like coffee hangout space, and they'll want this, and they'll, and if those things are happening, then community exists. But then like, how do you put enough in that kind of like people are kind of supported and provided for? And, that's also the job of the architect. I think, there is a real fetishizing within architecture of a lot of like ideas of how a successful space should look, and kind of trying to maybe install too much of that. So I think that's why, for me, the idea of cultural infrastructure is really important, because, often, for example, people, a city, like a city hall or whatever, kind of like urban level government will be like, we need a new cultural district. And I find that so fascinating, because like, what makes a cultural district? Is it the fact that, it's like King's Cross is a really good example, actually, because it's been celebrated as really successful on some levels. Obviously, Jake spent a lot of time there at CSM. So for those who aren't in London, this is the kind of King's Cross development around Central St. Martin's, this whole area of kind of goods yards behind King's Cross station that was had a lot of nightclubs and prostitution and I don't know, all sorts of other things going on, and then kind of has been redeveloped. And it's been lauded as very successful because they really kept all of the kind of heritage urban fabric, and they've really brought in this kind of, you know, there's no big chain stores there. It's this kind of interesting mix of small stores, but they literally cherry picked them, said, come and have a shop here. Like they gave them preferential, you know, I think a lot of them are given like discounted rates because there's a kind of curation of that environment and of the kind of culture that emerges there. And I think it's a perfect example of kind of like installing the end result, because you kind of need to have this idea of like culture existing, a cultural district existing, rather than understanding that a cultural district might look like a wasteland for 10 years and very slowly kind of in this you know, like permaculture notion of culture that's also kind of, I see being talked a lot about now in other approaches to city making. Is there's a lot of kind of, yeah, biological or kind of ecological metaphors and notions entering into this stuff now as well. Like, yeah, this kind of permaculture idea where like everything takes a very long time and kind of like one thing has to exist before then other things can start to kind of grow off of that. And for the Urban Backstages project, we've got 4 case study cities, and I've been doing work in Marseille and interviewing dancers who use a kind of dance space here and a dance rehearsal facility. And it's one that the city government kind of had an empty space that they owned, and they kind of offered it to this to a dance company to run, and in a very much the model of kind of urban pioneer, like let's put this arts organization here and it will kind of kickstart regeneration. And the space is amazing, and it's run by an artist, and all of the artists there feel so supported by the sensitivity that that person who set it up has to what they need. But then they're kind of saying like, but you know, the city's like shoved us out here, and like the only food we can buy is kebabs. You can't dance after eating a kebab. Like there's this kind of a lack of an ecological idea of actually what kind of a cultural district is one in which like you can buy vegetables, or in which you can buy screws to kind of like, you know, we're talking a lot about performance, but like you know, if you're talking about visual arts as well, there's all sorts, a whole kind of supply chain and ecosystem of materials and things like that that are needed. So it's a very long answer, but just to kind of say, I think it's about fundamentally getting away from the visual idea of what you think that success will look like versus a kind of like quite difficult to look at kind of ecological and connected notion of what is enabling that community to build slowly over time. And basically just like coming back to the original thing about architectural images, just like stop having Dezeen come and photograph buildings like 2 weeks after they're finished, and just literally ban that until like 5 years after, and then let's come and see, you know, let's kind of create an architectural culture in which you can build a space that looks like a failure because it's actually about the infrastructural conditions that are embedded into it. It's my manifesto for the evening.
We actually had it.
And I guess the scoring the city really helped. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
After you. I was just going to say that as part of the workshop, it helped me to get away from the spatial sense of space, which sounds silly, but I was looking more at kind of the materiality and the smells and the senses, and that in itself, having the score instead of something more architectural, completely liberated me. Yeah, just wanted to say that.
one of our previous guests, Mia Hegg, she has a practice called Habiter Autrement, and she does a lot of social housing. And she was telling us that she would come back. So her buildings were always meant as sort of frameworks for inhabitation. And she would always photograph the building when it was completed, and then after a year to see how the inhabitants had, I guess, populated it and appropriated the space, and use that as a way of drawing on her, you know, as almost like a tool for drawing on seeing how the space was used. And I think that was quite an interesting poetic addition.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, again, it's not like the reason I'm kind of not giving, I suppose maybe I did give a talk, but like, it's also conflicted for me as well, though, because I'm also like, you know, I was going to kind of come onto this in a way bigger and contextualizing it in kind of current political action and transformation that's kind of going on, and the like, the whole thing of pulling down statues and kind of the notion of destroying the symbolic realm of the kind of colonial city as a way to, you know, push against its politics or kind of, but so it's, I suppose my point here is like, I you know, the beautiful and the symbolic can be very important, one, either as a kind of like, you know, scores are also all very well and good, but you need performances as well at moments to kind of like bring them into a form in which they can encounter a public, or they can circulate, or that they can be celebrated, or they can just kind of like, we can revel in the beauty of what can come out of it. But then I suppose it's kind of like a perhaps older politics saw then that statue, or not an older politics, actually a politics which is kind of like in conflict right now. That statue that is then immutable, you know, it is the heritage, it is our heritage, and it should never be, you know, kind of vandalized or seen as something that can be done to. That we, you know, like, so there's a kind of tension between iconoclasm as like, you know, this political act of destroying the statue because we hate the statue. But then in a way, the iconoclasm can't happen without the statue having existed. Like, so you need these kind of heavy symbolic realizations of dominant culture to kind of also happen, so that they can then be destroyed as a kind of productive act of creativity. But then so that, you know, I'm kind of not saying like everything should be pure framework and no kind of like, no expression. It's just kind of what the kind of political relationship between expression and its outcomes and then what comes next, and what, you know, how that's seen in architecture. I mean, kind of like the Elephant and Castle shopping center that I got so fascinated with is like, got me think, you know, at a certain point, it was this kind of very like tightly formed, you know, modernist, I mean, maybe Elephant and Castle shopping center isn't the best example, but like 5 years after, you know, kind of works of architectural modernism were built, you wouldn't have started knocking the facades out in the inside and kind of adding like a Latin American bar kind of that protrudes out, and kind of adding some market stalls, and kind of like, there's a certain process where things open up from being finished artifacts to being kind of frameworks over time, as well as they kind of get distanced from the moment of creation, I was kind of saying earlier. But then also, yeah, so, you know, statues now, like you probably wouldn't go around pulling down like public art that was commissioned 5 years ago. It's kind of a violence against the person, against an individual in a sense, whereas like the statue 100 years later is a kind of like collective act of deconstructing, you know, the like crystallization of certain cultural ideas. So it's like, it's interesting how like these end results and these symbolic forms start to open up to being the sites of potential transformation over time as well, I suppose.
If it always takes a strong sign of power then to enable creative practice, then I guess we have a lot of creative practice coming within the next decade, especially in cities like London, or not even just particularly London or the great European metropolis. I mean, in your research, you showed that also minor cities have the capability of invoking large amounts of creative counter-resistance. It's interesting that somehow I'm trying to, I was taking notes and I'm now trying to form this to a question live. I noticed that the score somehow seems to work without scale. So also across professions or across different, I hate the word ideologies, but I mean, some of the groups are very conflicting. And yet the idea of a score or of the network theory always seems to have worked so far. And I wonder then in the text, you had this one line, the text which we include in the mail, the project in Rotterdam. But is it not with our voices that we truly participate in the public sphere? That's on page 4 for those of us who want to look it up. And then now in the lecture, you mentioned that the score is invisible knowledge infrastructure. And then when I try to combine these two, I wonder what happens when this, our voice in the public sphere is more and more channeled or even being taken over by the likes of Siri or, so what happens once the great infrastructures that we rely on take over the voices that we had earlier?
Not sure exactly how to answer that, but it's a good kind of, yeah, bringing us to this realm of voice and acoustics, and which is a whole kind of other aspect of it for me, I suppose. Yeah, maybe acoustics is kind of what I would offer. I mean, without going back to my crazy, oh no, maybe I will actually. Yeah, this project in Rotterdam, that text was like kind of written as an accompaniment to, was about finding kind of spaces where there were acoustic conditions that kind of transformed the voice beyond, transformed the voice beyond the kind of its usual everyday, without the need for technology. And realizing that there's so many of these spaces kind of accidentally built into the city. And it's not just that they amplify or that they work in a kind of uniform way, they work in very, very different ways. So this was one of the spaces, a huge railway flyover, actually super similar to the space that Eugenio, your film that you sent me, like very similar space to that. Unlike a British like railway infrastructure that usually has these brick arches and kind of much more this kind of flat modernist space, and it has like a particular acoustic, but then this amazing kind of articulation as with all of these columns. I wrote a series of scores for these infrastructure spaces. I'm trying to find it, but and we kind of we recorded activations of them, but in a way to kind of point to oh yeah, here we go, to point really simple scores for kind of actions in these spaces, to point and kind of make people aware of how there are these kind of like conditions within the built environment that can enable their voices to be kind of like carried further, or to hear one another better, or to kind of be transformed. Like, yeah, one of them was this kind of railway flyover. One of them was this long tunnel under the river, or under the, yeah, it's the river in Rotterdam. And one of them was this kind of like weird long travelator, like between the entrance of a metro and the kind of metro. And so just to kind of like, actually the exhibition itself that this was for in Rotterdam had a really interesting premise, which was about opera as a kind of way of thinking about like voice in the contemporary world, and how like opera is about kind of transforming the voice beyond its kind of normal human capabilities, and kind of what role opera plays, you know, in the world. So I suppose, yeah, I'm just kind of circling around the theme that your question raises, but it's kind of about like, I suppose, realizing that there are technologies of transformation of the voice kind of within the city that we kind of pass through all of the time, and that actually have the potential for different modes of gathering, different ways of hearing one another, kind of different transformations of the voice, and that they could, I think, be kind of, well, much better used in a way, but also that for me, acoustics are kind of another of these examples of like a kind of invisible enabling underlying condition that doesn't say the city should sound a certain way, but it says like, let's have a city where there's like spaces, resonant spaces that like amplify the voice, or muffling spaces where you whisper and you kind of like, you know, you become much more intimate with those around you, or kind of spaces that make your voice carry really far so you can actually call to someone at the other end, but which don't dictate kind of how you might use that, but open up kind of possibilities for different forms of, you know, communication without technology. So yeah, that's another thing. It's all very speculative, and it's kind of like bringing together a bunch of things that didn't necessarily belong together in the way they were conceived. But I suppose, yeah, what I'm really, as I said, trying to get at is this politics of that I was pointing to before, of kind of to what degree we need these kind of, we need performance as a notion, like where things come to fruition, things come to light, things become visible and completed, and to what degree we kind of need all of the conditions underlying that. And you know, if you think only about the kind of enabling conditions, you know, you lose the sense of kind of public culture, I suppose, of really sharing of then what comes out of that. But if you kind of like fetishize and kind of overvalue those outcomes, you start to kind of construct a city out of these like finished blocks rather than kind of out of a set of conditions that give, that defer the kind of right to produce not just the cultural, but the political environment to its inhabitants. That's my kind of, that's my question that like generates my kind of, starts me off on a research process, kind of probably outside of Theatrum Mundi towards a book of some kind. So yeah, this has been an attempt in kind of like thinking through all of that and piecing together a bunch of things that I realize now have kind of been connected by that same set of thoughts.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear your thought processes out loud and how you make relationships between different topics. One thing I found actually quite interesting when you showed the Spanish city, I can't remember which one it was.
Madrid.
Yeah, sorry, Madrid, but the area of Madrid, I can't remember the name. And it made me think about the difference between different kinds of cities, because obviously a city like London is much more prescriptive than a city in I guess the south of Europe, where I'm thinking a lot of sort of, I'm from Naples in Italy, and generally Italy is known for having sort of improvising a lot of their own rules, because obviously the structures in place don't really maintain an order in the sense of power, and therefore people are left to make their own rules. And I was going to ask you, do you think that the fact that cities like this, there is more flexibility within the framework, do you think that this differs from cities like, I don't know, London or New York or maybe Zurich, that are much more prescriptive in terms of their rules and regulations?
I think every city has these processes going on. Well, every city I've spent time in so far, but maybe also I am drawn towards cities where there particularly is this kind of emergence of improvised life in lots of ways. But I guess, yeah, like right down to, you know, the fact that like some people move the furniture around inside their houses to kind of just, you know, you walk into different people's houses and you think, what? I thought I knew how every house was supposed to work, and this is just completely different, you know. So these kind of very, very domestic and kind of personal scales of transgression or rethinking, right up to kind of like, you know, Torre David, where like a whole vertical, you know, community emerges in a disused tower block, where we think that like tower blocks, you know, we imagine kind of like informality as being this kind of very kind of low level, you know, non-high rise kind of like improvised form, that kind of actually informality can exist in like heroic kind of skyscraper as well. So yeah, I think kind of those different dynamics exist within every city, but I definitely think, yeah, some cities are kind of characterized much more by a trust in use and in habitation as a form of knowledge, versus cities that are characterized by a kind of constant attempt to rationalize and kind of like think that everything that kind of you know, moves outside of the kind of lines that are drawn on paper. And I say that in a very literal way, like in the sense that like, you know, in kind of urban planning, you have like the building line, and, you know, like there's regulation around kind of like what, as a shop or a cafe, you're allowed to kind of put outside the building line, for example. And obviously there's cities where that's really, really, really tightly regulated. And there's cities where absolutely anything goes, or where that building line doesn't exist at all, or where there's no map even that shows like what's in that. So I think it's, again, it's kind of like, I'm trying to point towards a set of dynamics that I think is to some degree universal, but they kind of play out in different ways in different places. And what, you know, I suppose the research question then is kind of like, how as an architect do you kind of, or as a city maker, from a kind of like trying to think of how things should work, like how do you navigate the right balance of that by learning from all of these different kinds of relationships, power relationships that play out within kind of like, you know, music, or within kind of like a bottom-up kind of space making project, or a kind of like you know, Elephant and Castle shopping center, or all of these kind of examples where there's different kind of relationships between the designed and the kind of like conceived, and then the kind of like the used, I suppose.
Yeah.
Do we have any final questions?
If not, it's 9:30 here and my partner's like very quietly making dinner. So like, and I told him off for being noisy, but like, I might head off and have dinner. And thank you all for sticking with me through these rambling thoughts until this point.
No, thank you, John. I think we have one final question. It'll be a quick one, which Julius will pose. As we, yeah.
Thank you, first and foremost, and then to all our guests so far, we've posed one final question because we're trying to assemble a positive list in spite of all, and we ask our guests if you were to give advice or to propose one thing that every one of us can do to improve our environments, what would you suggest? It can be anything. We've heard the broadest amount of propositions.
Be nice to your neighbors.
Yeah.
Basically.
That's very valid. Yeah.
It's just like, just the main thing.
Sorry, everybody. I'm just it's very interesting question, Julius. Quite heavy-handed question for the end, but it's a very interesting point. As an architect myself, we've spoken about how nowadays, the visual bias in architecture, where everything's about producing a final image for the Instagram, social media, Facebook, what, and some dense architecture had lost, a capacity to what it's like to navigate through a new building, what it's like to spatially do the choreography of going through an entrance door and through the spatially going up the stairs and into the light to touching the materials in the wall. We seem to have lost that sense of, well, how do we activate our other senses? Just as well as the visual, but the smell, the touch, and though I just think we could learn an awful lot from cities that were built 100, 200 years ago. The high density living above the shop, and so forth. And I think in today's area with COVID and the pandemic, and the city centres are losing their shape and function, there's no reason why we can bring back some of the more traditional values of city centre living, such as living above the shop, and just when you kind of bring people back to life, let people bring city back to life. So yeah, so that I'm very conscious that in every design process we undertake, it's really important from the very beginning of the concept process that we involve all stakeholders, all the people, all the community involved, at the very start of the project, rather than designing the building and then when it's gone out for tender, you tell people, oh, the building could look at this, but you get no input from the community leaders who knew the building. So it's about designing buildings inside out, and I think that's maybe a thought process I'd love to see change, getting more people involved in the early stages of the design process. So that's a very long-winded, response there, but hope it helps.
But I think sound is interesting in terms of high density living, because you can create visual privacy quite easily, but it's very difficult, to create sonic privacy. And again, I think I'm kind of torn between, romanticizing the idea of kind of living amongst one another's presence, which I love in many ways, although of course, like anyone, when the neighbors just decide to have a party, or when we decide to, and then we're trying to, but I suppose when I said be kind to your neighbors, it's beyond that. It's about kind of celebrating living amongst one another. But it's difficult because it also creates a kind of social normativeness, whereby there's this kind of sense of constant kind of adaptation and control to everyone else. So again, how do you also kind of have space for excess and transgression and kind of and difference and different rhythms of living? High density living works if everyone kind of goes to bed at 11:30. It works really well. You can hear each other's kids screaming and washing machine going and loud music playing and instruments during the day, and then you have quiet during night. But it's a very kind of homogeneous idea of society as well. So kind of, I think kind of thinking of the rhythm, sound is a very kind of transgressive sense in terms of how we live together in that sense. And it's a kind of an interesting, noise control is a kind of interesting challenge. Gassia obviously does a lot of work on has done a lot of work on challenging noise-based ideas of urban sound. But then of course, like any of us, will probably be upset if someone starts doing construction work at 1 a.m. So it's kind of, I think it's an interesting one to learn how to kind of create a culture of celebration of that friction, whilst also kind of like, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think these were two beautiful last statements. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, John. So this was John Bingham-Hall. Dear all, thank you very much for being here. Thank you,
Thank you all
also
for coming. Yeah,
thank you
it's
all
been
to our
lovely.
guests.
Thank you.
As always, you can get back to us or to John for any further questions. You can also ask us for the text and for further links. We've tried to document things that were important in the chat. That was a bit
Nice. Good work.
halfway. We tried halfway this time. We mentioned a lot, but you can get back to us in case for any further information. Otherwise, you can always refer to the websites of all institutions mentioned today. Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Thanks. And thanks for everyone for joining.
And work. Okay. Bye.
Have a lovely evening.
You too. Bye.
Bye to everyone.
Bye all.